when does your interaction with a horse matter? Is it when you have your own horse or you're leasing a horse and it's just the two of you more consistently? Or does the interaction still matter if you're riding a school horse or maybe even seeing a friend's horse on the weekend? I believe that every interaction we have with a horse, no matter how long, no matter if we're even going to see that horse again, I think it matters. I think it's important for us, and it's also important for the horse. So I really do believe that every rider is a trainer, and every time we interact with a horse, riding or just spending time with them on the ground, we're usually teaching them something. And we need to be aware of what it is that we are actually teaching them. So I'll explain a little bit more in just a minute. But if you're new here, I'm Callie, this is CRK Training, and this is a part of my weekly video show where I post a new video at the end of each week on a new riding or training tip or topic. And I started last week this little series of videos talking about this bigger picture of riding and how it really is important for every rider to start thinking more like a trainer in order to progress and also in order to work through challenges. And it doesn't matter if you own a horse or even if you've just started riding, you can start thinking like a trainer right away. So I'm going to tell you the 3 reasons that it's so important to really be more aware during any interaction that you have with a horse or with your horse. So the first one is the horse is always learning. And I don't necessarily mean learning something new, but the way that the behavior process works, the horse is always learning to kind of adapt his behavior. He's going to be doing more of some things, he's going to be doing less of some things. And a lot of this process happens unconsciously. It can happen unconsciously for the horse, and it can also happen without us being aware of it. We really can teach our horses some bad habits by just not knowing how the learning process works and what our role is in that learning process. And I'm going to give you an example of that and how that learning process works with food. So I'll do that just in a minute. The second one is the longer the duration of a behavior, the longer that something's done, the stronger the habit becomes. And this is just a product of how our brains work. Our brains work this way, the horse's brain works this way. The longer that we do something, the stronger that neural pathway becomes, and the more likely we are to go and do that thing again. And then also, the horse is an emotional and a social animal. So the relationship that we have with the horse is also important. The way that they view us, how comfortable they feel around us, it's going to affect how they behave. So I want to just teach you a little bit more about the basic learning process. Or I should say, not the learning process, but about the how behavior works. So there's kind of a general 3-step model to behavior. So a behavior starts with, if we're going to use the technical language, it would be an antecedent. We're going to call it a cue. So a behavior starts, it's cued by something. We often think about cues as riders as being, our rein aid, as being our leg against the horse, as shifting our weight. But a cue doesn't necessarily need to be that conscious. It doesn't necessarily mean something that we specifically train the horse to do. Sometimes, pretty much anything has a cue. So even if you're going out to catch your horse in the field and he sees you coming in the gate, that's a cue. And his behavior might be to see that and then walk up towards the gate to greet you. His behavior might be to just ignore that, or it might be to actually walk off the other way. So our cue doesn't necessarily have to be something that's trained, it's just something that triggers a behavior. So after the cue, we have the behavior, and then we have the consequence. And this consequence So what follows up the behavior is what's going to influence whether the horse is going to do more of this in the future or whether he's going to do less of this in the future. And this is where our basic training comes in. So anytime that we reinforce something by giving the horse a reward, maybe giving him a treat after he did something that we liked, or by taking away pressure. So letting our legs just hang after we were squeezing when the horse walks forward. Anytime that we reinforce a behavior, it's going to encourage more of it. If we punish a behavior, it's going to encourage less of it. And this process is happening all the time. Most of the time when we're actively training the horse, we're using, hopefully, reinforcement-based methods, whether that's releasing pressure or giving rewards. But what I want you to think of is not so much how this works in a specific training sequence, but starting to become more aware of how this works kind of behind the scenes. And I'm going to give you 2 examples to help you understand this. Jane just got her first horse, Fudge. And she goes to the barn one day to see Fudge. She's not planning on riding. She's had a stressful day at work. And she just wants to go and spend a little bit of time with him. So she takes along a bag of carrots to treat him, and she knows that he loves his carrots. So she gets to the barn, and she stands outside his stall. And of course, as soon as he hears her coming in and he hears that carrot bag crinkling around, he comes right over and he sticks his head over the stall door. So Jane gives him a carrot, and he reaches out for it and he takes it. And she stands there for maybe another 10 minutes, just petting him, and every time that he reaches over and he gives her a nudge, she feeds him a carrot. And then she leaves for the day. She says goodbye to Fudge. She heads out. The next day she comes to the barn, and she just has a few carrots in her pocket because today she's going to ride. She's got some training things that she wants to focus on. So she goes up to the front of Fudge's stall. He sticks his head over. He gives her a little nudge, and she feeds him a carrot. And then she goes in the stall and she puts his halter on, and he nudges her again. But now she's putting his halter on, she's focused on something else, and she ignores the little nudge. Well, then he nudges her again, harder. And she says, oh, I guess he wanted the carrot. So she brings the carrot out, she gives him another carrot. Now she brings him out to the barn aisle, and just as she's getting ready to put the cross ties on, he gives her another really hard nudge. She pushes his head away, and then he reaches over and he just gives a little nip, and he kind of grabs her jacket. Let's take a step back and now think through this situation like a trainer. So if you think back to that little 3-step process of behavior, there's a cue, there's a behavior, and then a consequence. So what happens after a behavior is going to encourage more of it or less of it, depending on what happens. And feeding horses is a place where behaviors can start really quickly, and if we're not aware of them, like Jane wasn't aware of Fudge's behavior, we can start to train our horse to do some things that we really don't want, like getting pushy, nudgy, or even starting to nip and bite. So what happened in this little story, in this little example, is every time that Jane went and she would give Fudge his carrot and he would push against her, she would give him another carrot. So she was essentially rewarding his nudginess. And then the next day when she came, and she wasn't just doling out the carrots at every little nudge, but she held out a little longer because she was focused on other things, he increased the behavior that had been working just fine the day before, pushing against her to get the food, and he pushed against her harder and harder, and eventually went up to that little nip. If Jane would have been thinking more like a trainer and recognizing how her interaction with Fudge, even just simply hanging out with him for a few minutes after a stressful day at work, actually influenced his behavior, she could have recognized that by feeding him after his nippiness or after his pushiness that first day, she was actually rewarding that behavior. And she could have stopped, taken a step back, and when she went to Fudge again, just held on to the carrot until he took his head away, rewarded that behavior, and she still could have had a good time with him, fed him a few carrots, but she could have taught him something useful and taught him a good skill to just stay quiet and keep his head away when there was food present, instead of accidentally teaching him to get a little pushy. Let's consider a riding example for how the same awareness of simple behavior principles can help you in a lesson setting. So Sue comes out to the barn and she's going to ride Blossom in her lesson. And as soon as she sees on the board that she's riding Blossom, she knows that Blossom has the reputation for being the slow, lazy horse on the farm. So she's like, oh great, I'm going to have a leg workout today. So Sue goes out, she gets Blossom, gets her ready, they go out for the lesson. And when she starts riding her, she gets on, she puts her leg on really strong like she's expecting to. She kicks her away hard from the mounting block. And Blossom starts to move forward. And she actually moves forward pretty willingly in the beginning. But Sue knows that Blossom tends to get lazy, so she keeps her leg really strong. And as soon as Blossom goes forward, she keeps her leg there because she's got to keep her moving forward. And as the ride goes on, just like 10 minutes in, Blossom starts to get not quite as forward. She's starting to go a little bit slower. So Sue tries to go even harder. She squeezes her hard, she gives her a kick, and then she keeps her leg there really tight in order to try to keep her moving forward. But the stronger that Sue tries to get with her leg to keep Blossom moving, the more that Blossom just keeps getting slower and getting less and less responsive when she tries to get her to move. So half an hour into the lesson, Sue's feeling really frustrated. She can barely get Blossom to move. She can barely keep her in the trot. Her legs are getting tired, and she just doesn't understand it. Maybe she needs to get to the gym and build up her legs and get a little bit stronger if she's going to have to keep riding these lazy lesson horses. So again, if we kind of step back and now we think about this little story with Sue and Blossom, but we think about it like a trainer, we can see a clear picture of what happened here. It may be true that Blossom is a lesson horse and her tendency is to go slower, but any horse can learn really quickly to respond to can respond lightly and also respond to smaller cues and respond really quickly. In fact, when Sue started her ride, Blossom was going forward pretty nicely. But if we think about it, because Sue kept her pressure there, she kept her leg really tight in order to try to keep the forward momentum, Blossom never got any kind of a reinforcement because she never got a release of the pressure to tell her that going forward was the right thing and to encourage more of that behavior. Again, thinking back to that simple 3-step process of how behaviors work. So the stronger that Sue tried to get with her leg, the more that Blossom actually slowed down, and the more that Blossom started recognizing that going forward did nothing to release Sue's leg, the more she just kept going slow and getting less and less responsive, more and more dull to that leg aid. If Sue would have ridden that a little bit differently, so if she would have came out with Blossom, and as soon as she got on, she gave her a little bit of a leg cue for forward and Blossom started to go, she took her leg off. She just let her leg hang there softly. That would have reinforced the forward movement from Blossom. And if Sue would have continued doing that consistently, she probably could have had a really nice forward horse moving off of a much smaller leg cue by the end of her ride, instead of feeling frustrated. So here were 2 examples of how these 2 riders, both one that had her own horse and also with Sue that just rode Blossom in a weekly lesson, how both of these riders, if they could have just been a little more aware of how learning happens and how behavior changes with the horse that they were interacting with, they would have had a lot more success and a much more pleasant experience, encouraging more good behavior in the little story with Blossom and preventing the development of a bad behavior in the story with Jane and Fudge. To me, thinking like a trainer is not about having to get tough with the horse and make it happen or don't let him get away with anything, but instead it's just, again, developing more of that awareness of how behavior happens and what our role is in that behavior so that we can make some changes. We can make progress in our riding, we can create a better relationship and connection with the horse, and we can work through any challenges that come up. And that's really my goal in all of the courses and the programs that are created here through CRK Training, is to empower you that you can understand this big picture, you can see how things work together, and you can choose what is going to be the best path forward for you. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about more in the next video, because I recognize we've kind of covered some pretty broad topics, and now I want to help you understand how you can break this down so that you know exactly what to do next, really. So what I would love to have you do is first just leave a comment and tell me one situation with your horse, with a horse that you ride or work with. What is one situation that you could be a little bit more aware of what's really happening, what's reinforcing the behavior, and what's your role in that? So go ahead and leave that in the comments below, and then make sure to watch for next week's video.